Hello and welcome to From Time to Time a Poem. I'm Deborah Ellis. I'm an author for Loescher, Editore and Helbling Languages and a teacher in a liceo in Vicenza. This is my fourth presentation in the series and I hope you've been enjoying them so far. This presentation has been inspired by recent events in the US. The election of Joe Biden as president kind of drew my attention away from Europe and made me really curious as to know who the present poet laureate in the US was. I discovered it was a poet called Joy Harjo, and I started to investigate her beautiful and unique voice. Then, as I was preparing and working on the presentation, came Biden's inauguration. It was a huge moment, of course, after all the strife. But who was it who stole the headlines, stole them from Joe Biden, even stole them away from Kamala Harris, if that's possible? It was a poet, and the reading of an inaugural poem commissioned for the day. And that was how I discovered that the US has two poets laureate, not one, a youth poet laureate and a full senior poet laureate. Amanda Gorman was named the US's first ever Youth Poet Laureate in 2017, and there have been Youth Poets Laureate every year since. So, from a focus on a single poet and a single idea, this has developed into a presentation of two, Joy Harjo, current Poet Laureate, and Amanda Gorman, Youth Poet Laureate 2017. A little bit of background to laureateship. After the classical period, probably the first poet laureate was an Italian, Albertino Mussato, and in the same period, of course, Petrarch, who is often depicted wearing his laurel wreath crown. In England, it was Dryden, who was appointed in 1668 by Charles II, while in Scotland, the first Scots Marker, or royal bard, was appointed in 2014. A year later, the national poet for Wales, 2005. In Ireland, a little earlier, the Irish C, or Wise One, historically the title of the head of a bardic school. The first investiture was in 1985, and that role is not limited just to poets, but to others involved in the arts. In the US, in the part of the world which interests us in this presentation, the first national poets were called Consultants in Poetry to the Library of Congress. And they go as far back as 1937. Instead, they begin to be called National Poet Laureate with Robert Penn Warren in 1986. And as we said before, the first ever National Youth Poet Laureate was Amanda Gorman, a title given to her in 2017. If you look back through the Poets Laureate of various countries, it's not surprising that there are a number of household names, given that the prerequisite for appointment is poetic excellence. So in the UK, Wordsworth, Tennyson, Betjeman, they all line up with great poets of today, such as Hughes, Duffy, Armitage. In the US, a whole list of names that you will recognize, including Robert Frost, Louise Glück, who we did a presentation on. The first presentation was based on her poem Snowdrops, and the hilarious, irreverent Billy Collins, a wonderful read. Ireland amongst its seas boasts, of course, Heaney, Brian Friel, Edna O'Brien, among others. What is the laureate's role? Well, as we said, laureateships are granted for poetic excellence. And at different times in history, the poets have been asked to write poems for special occasions. But now, I suppose in respect of different types of creative process, and most laureateships have no formal requirements. The poets often do commemorate moments or periods of significance in their work, but some do not, perhaps because they do not write to command, and they may dedicate their time in office to promoting instead a poetry project, an area, an idea, an issue which is very dear to them. Joy Harjo, our present American Poet Laureate, said of the role, "It's good to have someone who's prepared to say poetry is part of our national life." And I think that's probably the best thing a Poet Laureate can do, really keep poetry in the forefront of national life, keep poetry close to the people, use it to comment, to teach, or just to bring pleasure, but to keep poetry in mind. So our first American Poet Laureate is Joy Harjo. She was born back in 1951 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She is a full member of the Muskogee Nation, a nation which is also referred to as the Creeks. She's not only a poet, she's also a great saxophonist, and she often performs her poetry to music alongside her. She'll have a band playing music, and she will perform rather than simply read. She can be considered part of the second wave of Native American artists and poets, the second wave Renaissance. And as we said, she was appointed as Poet Laureate back in 2019, but she is still in this particular role because she was reappointed to a second and a third term in 2020. She is the first Native American to be appointed Poet Laureate. Now, her particular project, what she's dedicating her time to, is to making other poets, other First Peoples poets, known to the nation. And she's doing this by, she's created a website which you can visit called Living Nations, Living Words. When you go on the website, you get a map of North America covered in location markers. When you click on a location marker, it reveals a Native Nations poet. You will get a picture of the poet, a biography of the poet, a live reading of one of the poems, as well as a commentary on that poem. So this is her way of publicizing and bringing to national attention a large number of First Peoples poetry and poets. Now, I chose one poem. It was a difficult choice. The range of poetry that Joy Harjo writes is extraordinarily extensive and very varied. So I'm going to use her words to begin. I'm going to use the words from another poem. This is a poem we're not going to look at together. This is a poem which I think the opening lines is a great introduction. I'm going to ask you to settle down, to enjoy Joy, and in her words, put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off that cell phone, computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by friendly winds. Great way to get attention. Great way. Something I would need to read to my students on a weekly basis. So the poem that I've chosen is a poem called Running, and I think I chose it because of its depth. Harjo herself said of this poem, it's a memory. It's a memory of an event, of a moment in her life, which she had trouble making sense of. And so by writing a poem, by using poetry, she worked through the event in her mind, and it began to have sense and a place in her memories, in her background. This use of poetry to work through an emotion, work through an event, and to exercise negative feelings towards something that's happened or towards people who might have hurt you, is something that Joy Harjo and First People's poetry often engages in. So what we're going to do, because of its complexity, I'm going to read the poem through, and then we're going to look at it to try to unravel the story behind the poem, the events which have taken place, the memory of Joy Harjo. Before we look at some of the issues she deals with, her more characteristic referencing. So here is the poem running. It's closing time. Violence is my boyfriend with a cross to bear, hoisted on by the church. He wears it everywhere. There are no female deities in the Trinity. I don't know how I'm going to get out of here, said the flying fish to the tree. Last call. We've had it with history. We who look for vision here in the Indian and Poetry Bar, somewhere to the left of hell. Now I have to find my way when there's a river to cross and no boat to get me there, when there appears to be no home at all. My father gone, chased by the stepfather's gun. Get out of here. I found my father at the bar, his ghost at least, some piece of him in this sorry place. The boyfriend's convincing to a crowd. Right now he's the spell of attraction. What tales he tells. In the fog of thin hope, I wonder this sad world we've made with the enemy's words. The lights quiver, like they do when the power's dwindling to a dangling string. It's time to go home. We're herded like stoned cattle, like children for the bombing drill, out the door into the dark street of this old Indian town where there are no Indians anymore. I was afraid of the dark, because then I could see everything. The truth with its eyes staring back at me, the mouth of the dark with its shiny moon teeth. No words, just a hiss and a snap. I could hear my heart hurting with my in the dark ears. I thought I could take it. Where was the party? It's been a century since we left home with the American soldiers at our backs. The party had long started up in the parking lot. He flew through the dark, broke my stride with a punch. I went down, then came up. I thought I could take being a girl with her heart in her arms. I carried it for justice, for the rights of all Indians. We all had that cross to bear. Those old ones followed me, the quiet girl with the long dark hair, the daughter of a warrior who wouldn't give up. I wasn't ready yet. To fling free the cross, I ran and I ran through the 2 a.m. streets. It was my way of breaking free. I was anything but history. I was the wind. So, Harjo said about her poems that she likes to begin with a seed of an emotion, a place, and then move on from there. So a place and an emotion. Here, the setting is a bar at closing time, after a long evening's drinking, and the emotion is fear. fear of violence. In fact, it begins with the fear of her boyfriend's violence, a man who has learned the place of women from the teachings of the church. And like a flying fish in a tree, she's in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no apparent way out. At this point, the barman shouts out the last call, and the feeling, the mood changes from fear to drab disillusionment in the bar, where American Indians come to drink and to read and listen to poetry. It's not a place of inspiration, as it should be. People do come there to find vision, to find hope, but they find themselves in a kind of miserable hell of alcohol and loneliness. The speaker is obviously very alone. She has to find her own way. She has no help in overcoming her situation, no boat to assist her in crossing the river, because her family support is not there. She has no home. Her father has gone. The stepfather, who replaced him, has ordered her out of the house at gunpoint, while the ghost of her father, small comfort, is brought to mind by the bar, by the fact there is too much alcohol, by the threat of violence. Her mother, she's not mentioned. It's a frightening, lonely place to be, frightening and sorry. Her boyfriend in the bar is holding court. Is he telling stories, reciting his poems? At least the crowd find him convincing, suggesting that perhaps she's not so sure. He's not described as the center of attention, but the spell of attraction. He's mesmerizing, but only briefly. Hope, the feeling of hope is lingering on a very fine thread. It's not elucidating. It's described as foggy, and part of the sad, sorry place they are, where the language used is the language of the colonizer, the language which they use to write their poems, but hate, and it reinforces the sadness and the sense of oppression. The bar is closing. They are all herded out the door like animals or like children. She goes out into the dark, and we feel her instincts kick in, hyper-awareness of her surroundings and of the dangers which lie within it. Her fears are not just of the moment. They're an integral part of her life. And in the dark, at night, when she is alone, she realizes her vulnerability and the bad choices she has made. The truth. And even though her instincts are warning her, she goes in search of her company. Where was the party? Dismissing the dangers from the past, they're centuries old, she forgets that the danger can also come from within. She walks towards the group of people who have continued drinking out in the car park, towards her boyfriend, who comes flying at her and punches her and floors her. She goes down, but then she gets up. She takes strength from who she is, where she has come from, and flings herself free of the cross. A girl in what seems like a dead-end life, a dead-end relationship, gets up and runs and runs. She sees the potential. She sees a future. She's freeing herself. She is the wind.